Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Shannon Trainor Stark, Managing Director, Solutions Consulting of Google Marketing Platform. The topic of today's episode is best practices for experimentation. This episode is fascinating because with PreSales Collective, we continue to talk about innovation and experimentation and challenging status quo. And this is what Shannon has built her career on. And she's had so many successes and so many failures. And so in today's episode, she's going to discuss how you create that culture where failure is celebrated, the impact it can make on your team and on your organization. I'm going to get into it lightly in the beginning, but this is a very special episode for me because Shannon was my first sales engineering mentor. And she has been so influential and impactful for me in my career. So I'm honored to have her on today's episode. Enjoy. Today's episode is sponsored by Avneo. Feeling a little overwhelmed in your bid management, thinking there must be a better and more efficient way to manage RFPs, RFIs, and security questionnaires? Look no further than Avneo RFX, a Salesforce native, fully automated RFX solution designed to help you win more of the right business. To learn more, head over to avneo.com or search Avneo in the Salesforce App Exchange. Shannon Trainor Stark, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm good, Shannon. This is a rewarding episode for me because in my pre-sales career, you're actually the first mentor that I ever had. I think it was Kyle Parrish, who was my VP of sales, put me in touch with you. And I would come to your office in Google and we would have lunch. I'd pick your brain, ask you questions. And here we are today. But really, Shannon, those conversations were the genesis and the idea of PreSales Collective. So I have to give you some credit because going out to leaders like yourself who've been there, done that, are what I realized I needed and wanted to share that type of information. So it's kind of funny how things come full circle.
I love it. And you can just send me a check tomorrow. That's fine.
Perfect. I'll put the check in the mail, Shannon. Well, I'm excited to get into today's episode, but I want to talk about you first and talk about your pre-sales background and experience. Talk to us about your pre-sales career.
Yeah, it's funny. I talk to people about this all the time. I stumbled upon pre-sales, or I'll just say sales engineering to be specific right now, by accident. I had gotten my MBA and ended up as a consultant, as one does, at Accenture. And I was doing the consulting gig out of Chicago, oddly enough, and wasn't loving it, but it was a good job. I was learning lots. Decided to relocate back to the Bay Area. And in about 2001, after the first dot-com bubble burst, I was out of work and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I stumbled across a job at a small startup that did marketing analytics called Biz360. And they were looking for what they called a product specialist. And I was like, well, I could be specialized in the product, so I'll try that. So I ended up getting the job. What it really was, it was a sales engineering role. And I loved it. So you would go in, you were the product expert. You had to use your presentation prowess to tell stories. I loved being the objective stakeholder in the sales cycle. I loved being the resource. I loved coming to the rescue and helping move the deal forward. And that is how I stumbled upon sales engineering, even though, again, it was called a product specialist. Was there for 3 years and enjoyed it, but had sort of outgrown the company. And I put my resume into Salesforce.com's hiring bucket and was hired as a sales engineer. And that's where I got my true training as an SE. I came in and was working with some top-notch talent. My beloved boss, Greg Tate, who's still at Salesforce, taught me so much about being an SE. I was there for 8 years, and that's how I stumbled into the role. And I tell everybody, even people that aren't sales engineers, that it's the best job in the world.
One of the things that we talk about with the PreSales Collective is the best job that no one's ever heard of. And it's our job and our responsibility with PreSales Collective to bring more awareness to this role. I do want to highlight one thing about your experience at Salesforce.com, because you have to be one of the first people, to my understanding, that put together the deal request system in Salesforce. Is that an accurate statement?
That was early days of Salesforce. And then I have used that with every company I've ever gone to. So it's a way to selfishly, kind of streamline matching a deal up with an SE, but then it gives you instant metrics, instant reporting, instant insights. I've used that after I left Salesforce. I went to a little company called Wildfire. We built it into that company. And I actually have built it into my current group. And then we use it across my whole pre-sales organization. And it's super, super helpful.
Well, I'm excited to get into today's topic of best practices for experimentation. This is a topic with PreSales Collective and the Leadership Collective we continue to talk about is experimentation and trying things. And sometimes I think some pre-sales professionals can be a little bit more risk adverse, and sometimes some organizations don't always allow for it. And so one of the things that we've been talking about a lot as a community is how do we bring that to the forefront? I want to hear your experience throughout, because I know your experience at Salesforce and Wildfire and Google have really led to a lot of trying things, failing, and succeeding. Let's start off with definition. In your opinion, Shannon, what does experimentation in pre-sales actually mean?
So I think everybody knows what experimentation means, but in this context, in a pre-sales context, we're looking at a way to pursue multiple outcomes during a sales engagement or in a deal for our clients to find the best outcome. And it's comprised of three things. I look at the notion of iteration, over and over again, trying new things, the notion of measurement, because if you're not measuring it, how do you know if it was successful? So how do you get from here to there? And then I also think about experimentation in terms of culture. It's both culture with your clients, external culture, partnering with your client to go on this experimentation journey, but it's also internal. You touched on it. It's the comfort with failure. It's the appropriate risk taking, building that into everything you do.
And that's so interesting. And so maybe let's just talk about the why. As a leader and someone who's been doing this for quite some time, why is it important to essentially create this experimentation in the pre-sales process?
I think what worked 5 years ago, 3 years ago, a year ago is not going to work today. We call it business as usual. What worked for business as usual 5 years ago shouldn't work for what we need to do today. So new services or operating models or success metrics or even hiring practices are critical to being relevant, to driving, success, and to bringing on the best talent. Just look at the last 18 months, right? So we've been in pandemic land. We went from being in the office, and I was 5 days a week, maybe 4 days a week in the office, but in seat, to being at home. And we had to figure out and experiment how to be both successful with our clients, but also successful as managing our teams. And it's led to going forward, we're going to have new approaches to our work environment. Google, which is a large company, is actually evolving our work in some of the groups to become a hybrid, 3 days in the office. That's a seismic shift for Google. Now, I know there are other companies that are going fully remote or some sort of cross-section of that. But for Google, we're going to 3 days a week in the office. That's a big deal. And it comes from the big giant experiment that was the pandemic.
I like how you put that, because what I know of Google is the campus, and the on-campus experience is what people go to work for Google for. There's that sense of belonging and that culture that you mentioned. How do you create a culture of experimentation within your pre-sales organization, absent of the larger organization? How do you make that part of your DNA?
That's a good question. And it's not as prescriptive as I would like, but I'll give you a couple examples. So part of it comes with your hiring and your hiring practices and bringing on talent that is comfortable with the notion of experimentation. So you need to build your hiring pipeline and onboard pre-sales team members that want to take risks. And that comes through as part of the interview, James. You're going to ask questions that give you insight into that. It's going to come through as you look at that person's background, but it's also going to come through, I guess it's a little bit squishy, but how this person gels with the interview panel and those kinds of things. So hiring is one thing. And then the other thing is celebrating failure. And that is a cultural aspect. We do it a bunch of different ways. We had a global offsite February before the pandemic, and we brought together all our pre-sales counterparts for our side of the business. And we had a category called Worst Meeting I Ever Had. And we had 3 or 4 people come on stage. It's a 5-minute talk. And there are learnings from those bad meetings, whether it is lack of prep or there's a variety of different things that could have gone wrong. And so we celebrate those failures so that you bring those into the forefront as I will do this differently moving forward. Then the last piece is building structure into what you do. So Experimentation sounds amazing. Yeah, we experiment. Look, we're on board. We're in the Harvard Business Review because we're experimenting. Well, you have to have a framework that allows you to track experiments, report on how they've gone, and then build them into things going forward, whether it's business planning or I don't know, even how you do a demo. So that's how I like to think about it.
That's so interesting, Shannon, because I think we hear a lot of companies who say that we celebrate failures, but they don't have the framework woven into their DNA, like we've talked about. Those are very pure examples. And talking about tracking and measuring failure, that's something that I would assume most people don't do, from my understanding.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the things you highlighted earlier that I am really curious about is you talked about multiple outcomes for the customer. So how do you as a leader and how do your teams get that buy-in from your customers that you're willing to get them to go on a little bit of an experimental path with you to find the best outcome? Because that sounds like something we could say, hey, this is part of our culture. This is what we do in the process. But if they're not bought into that, that could bring in risk to your sales cycle.
So that's a good question. And I don't know that I have a formulaic approach for this, but I'll tell you things that we do that make this possible. Obviously, you have to have a level of trust with your client that will make them comfortable going on this experimentation journey. So that comes down to your AE building those relationships, or your sales engineer with their technical counterparts, or your marketing science person on my side and the data science person on the client side. You have to have a relationship where you can have that back and forth. It has to be textbook trusted relationship. So that's foundational. Then you have to have an explicit conversation. We like to call these meetings top to top. So we have our top sales leader talking to their top CMO, and we talk about what experimentation will mean for them. There's always a business case or a use case that shows them that it's in their best interest. And then we ask for a commitment to go on the journey. And we ask for skin in the game. So it's not just us doing a bunch of work and then saying, hey, look, this worked and that worked. What do you want to do? If they don't have skin in the game, and that's true for any sales cycle, they're not going to move forward with that. Those are the things we look for. And then if we're going to do a discovery session, we just hammer on the notion of experimentation at the beginning, at the end, and it becomes part of every engagement. If it's one of my product specialist teams going deep in connected TV, they touch on it at the beginning and touch on the end. So it's just a through line through everything we do.
It's such an interesting perspective. And one of the things that you've already highlighted, but I want to double down on, is this idea of incorporating it into your operation. And you and I have talked about this previously. And as I understand it, you have a marketing science team that has really built themselves on experimentation. Is that an accurate statement? And tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So marketing science, the term, has probably only been around for 3 or 4 years. It's a group of individuals that have data science training, degrees, background, but they're applying their mathematical masterminds, because it's certainly beyond my know-how, to marketing insights. That's what the team does. If it seems like I know this, the PreSales Collective may not know, this is a very ad tech term. So to give you context there, their whole job is to take a bucket of data, parse it up in different ways so that they build insights for the client. Couple of examples, and again, not my expertise, but I can talk at a high level for these things. So something like geo-based analysis. So they're taking sales data from a client, maybe a retailer of some kind, and they're combining that with the client's media investments, and they're going to, with that analysis, determine an ROI by geography. So it will help a client like, I don't know, if we take this, my favorite thing in the world, a Starbucks cup. Starbucks can then look at where they want to focus their marketing efforts by zip code, as an example. So it's a powerful way to tease insights out of data. Another one is offline to online, which is connecting your client product usage data, those metrics, with website behavior, and then you can come up with lifetime value metrics. And that helps you understand your client base. It helps you do segmentation. It helps you target the most lucrative clients. So it seems like magic to me, but my marketing science team assures me that this is all very data-driven and doable. So those are a couple of examples from a marketing science. But if you would let me, I will pivot this and talk about it from more of the squishy side of things, which would be maybe my product specialists or value consultants or even the SEs. They are doing experiments with clients, and they use a structured approach with that. They're going to, again, like we talked about, find us a framework that has the scope of your experiments. They're going to figure out what some possible outcomes are. They're going to explore those, disprove or verify, and then they're going to exit their experiment with some success criteria. That can be very open and exploratory, or it can be more retrospective and data-driven. That framework, though, applies for even the SEs, the value consultants, et cetera. But I'll give you also one that's more cultural. Before my time in my current group, we had a leader in this org that was focused on the right way to assign sales engineering resources to our sales leaders. And this person believed that you need to have a proactive vertical alignment and that it's hard and fast. And this SE is always connected to automotive. I don't disagree with that, except we did not have enough headcount to go around. So inevitably, there were verticals that were seeing no love, getting no support. So our sales engineering leader embraced an experiment, said, okay, I hear what you think is the right way, sales leader, but let me showcase maybe a different approach. So they did a controlled experiment where they had a control group and an experiment group where they had the proactive, like you're always automotive, the automotive. Then they also had a group where it was more of a pooled approach. A request would come in. There'd be a quick assessment using my deal assignment to determine who the right person was based on bandwidth, background, experience, and they would assign that person to the deal and go from there. So they did that for 2 quarters, which not a ton of time. And they got feedback from AEs to think of ease of use. How well did this work for me? They talked to the SEs about their bandwidth. And then they did look at business outcomes, but sales cycles are 9 months long. So we didn't have as many of those as we would like. And not surprisingly, everybody was on board for the more, we used reactive, but I would call it more pooled approach. You were still getting vertical expertise, but the SEs were able to cover more with the same amount of headcount. And the business leader got the outcome that person needed.
I love that story, Shannon. My favorite thing about being in pre-sales anyway is like when the light bulb goes off when you're talking to a customer, and the light bulb just went off with me when you were explaining that approach. That is fascinating. And that's really experimenting and measuring within your organization. I mean, that is a pure example of success. And it sounds like we need to continue to talk about successes. We've talked about building experimentation into your DNA and having a framework. We've talked about highlighting the failures, but let's talk a little bit more about those successes. So you obviously have run some pilots, you have a framework, you've measured it, you have success criteria. What are some other ways that you incorporate the successes into the culture to celebrate, hey, we took this risk and here's the reward of it?
I think my favorite way, and it's a little bit vain, but I'll talk to you about it. We have a contest that this will be our 4th year doing it, and it's called Stark Tank. It's a play on Shark Tank. And I'm proud of this because it was my brainchild. And so it's called Stark Tank based on Shark Tank. And it's what we call an innovation contest. What we do every year, we start in October, so I'm getting things together for it. We put out a call for innovative go-to-market engagements with clients. The requirements are this engagement, experiment, whatever you want to call it, has to have been implemented with a client. Okay, so it can't be something cool that you'd like to do that you haven't done. It has to be measurable in some way. And that could include revenue, CSAT, those kinds of things. And it needs to include a salesperson, pure play seller, and a solutions person, someone from my world. That's what we call pre-sales here. So those are the requirements. So we put a call out, send me your innovative engagements. And I usually get every year between 40 and 50. Then we go through and we take the list and we cull it down to top 5, which is tough, but we get there. Then we have a live Stark Tank 2-hour extravaganza with 3 sharks. I'm usually a shark, my boss. And last year we had my boss's boss, which was a big deal. And I'm going to hopefully bring him back this year. Each team gets 7 minutes to present, and there's 3 minutes of questions. And they do it a la Shark Tank. So they come to the table very like, hi, sharks. And then we evaluate each, and there's a winner. And there's some contest winning. It's like a sales contest. And so everybody in the top 5 makes money, but the top 3 get a little bit more. I look forward to it every year. It's been stolen across Google, and I'm happy to see that. And we're going to do it again this year.
That sounds so fun. And people probably really look forward to it because they're like, hey, I'm going to try this for a customer. Hopefully it makes sense. And I'm going to go present it on Stark Tank later in the year.
That's right. And you're making me think, James, just as we celebrated failures during our global offsite, maybe we need a category for Stark Tank for most spectacular failure. I'll have to think about that. How do we scale something like that? So yeah, I'm excited. And it's something we're going to do again this year.
As an outcome of this podcast and PreSales Collective, I'm going to feel really good about that. I'm going to follow up with you about that, Shannon. I am curious, on the success side, I love the frameworks that you've built. I'm a framework person myself. I just think that it helps with velocity and efficiency. But is there one particular example of a success that really stood out to you and resonated with you throughout your career?
There's a ton of recency bias right now and halo effect and all the biases that exist for me right now. But I'll talk to you about what I'm neck deep in as part of my job today. So ad tech is changing. For any ad tech SEs on the call, I apologize because you're going to say no duh. But for anyone else, the ad tech landscape is changing. Cookies, which have been kind of the anchor point of advertising, are going away in 2023. And this is a big change for advertisers because the cookie is the kernel of every strategy since the beginning of online advertising. So it's going away. The cookie is going away. So we need to help clients make that transition off cookies. So we designed a program at the beginning of the year that we call the Privacy Journey. It's not the best name, but it is what it is. It's an experimentation journey where we have a set number of steps or engagements that we take the client through to help them make this turn. And what the hope is together we will identify privacy safe ways to target potential customers, consumers on the web, moving off of cookies that will be as effective or better once cookies go away in the second half of 2023. So what this means is we are doing experiments, both data-driven experiments a la my marketing science team, but also SE experiments and value consulting experiments to help the client make the transition. We're measuring where they are today, where they'll be if they go more privacy safe. We're documenting that, and we're putting together outcomes that the client can embrace so that they're ready for this change. It's a long-term program because it's 2023 I'm talking about, but it's important to both help the client make that transition while maintaining business as usual. And I'm pumped about it. And I've learned a lot about change management as a result of this exercise.
That's incredible, Shannon. We're actually talking about change management in the PreSales Leadership Collective a lot with leaders and executing that in the organization. But talk about a project that has massive implications. I mean, those are global that will affect millions, billions of people. I mean, unbelievable.
Yes, I agree it's the right thing to do for consumers' privacy. I'm on board, but I also want my advertisers to still be able to find James and sell you a pair of Nikes if that's what we need to do. So I think there can be a cliche win-win in this situation, and I'm working with clients to make it happen.
I love that, Shannon. I'm really excited to hear how that goes because that is a massive undertaking, has a lot of risks with it, but it's obviously massively important and has implications. I want to get your perspective on the opposite side when it comes to experimentation. Have you ever encountered a senior leader or someone within the leadership or executive group who really discouraged the idea of experimentation? And how did you go about that?
There is a concern when you're dealing with a CMO of a huge company coming to the table with a failure of any kind, unless you understand the nuance of experimentation, can seem like a huge risk. So I think we have focused on, as I said, bringing experimentation into the narrative and making our clients know that this is going to be the process. And when things go wrong, we'll share that. And when things go right. So I can't give you a specific example of a client right now that has been frustrated with us because of failure. Because truthfully, as long as we've been open and honest about what we're doing, they're on the journey with us and they want to try something new. I have an example of an education client where we did an experiment and the hope was we were going to prove that this approach that was using geo-based analysis would result in better conversions for the client. That's not what happened. It was inconclusive at best. So what we did was we said, all right, back to the drawing board. Let's take a different tack. And we're in the process, this is very recent, we're in the process of defining what the next experiment is going to be. So because of our relationship with this edu client, I don't think they were stoked that the experiment didn't result in crushing results, but they understood it was an experiment and we're on to the next thing. But that's based, again, on the culture, the relationship, the trust that we have with the client.
That's a great example. You mentioned trust earlier. Managing expectations and trust are key components. Shannon, I want to ask you two questions on advice for those that are listening, whether they're ICs or leaders around experimentation. And a little bit of a backstory on today's episode is that when you and I were discussing topics and you talked about experimentation, one of the things that we talked about was innovation. And to me, this is how I've essentially built my pre-sales career. This is how Pre-Sales Collective exists. I even presented to Consensus. Horizontal networking fosters innovation. It's this concept of trying something new, understanding what works, what doesn't work, what people are doing differently to challenge your status quo. So you're a leader who has done this time and time again, successfully, unsuccessfully per se as well. What type of advice do you give individuals or leaders who really want to create this environment and culture of experimentation, but are facing challenges within their organization?
The one thing I would say is that you've got to take a systematic approach to this. It's almost like you're building an experiment, right? You got to take a systematic approach to infusing experimentation into your organization. I would say start with a challenge. Don't start with all the challenges. Start with a challenge. And then I think it's worthwhile to dig into the challenge. What is the challenge? Where are you in the process? What needs to be changed? Is it a strategy? Is it execution? Is it measurement? Go deep into that challenge and determine what's inside your control and what's outside your control. You can move things that are inside your control. If you think about how to do that, you can build some insights and influence decision makers to move whatever mountain or boulder that is. If it's outside your control, my advice is think about what part of the problem you can bring into your control. I'll give you an example. Connected TV is a nascent space in ad tech, somewhat nascent, and we're trying to go after it just like our competitors, but we don't have the product features we need to be as successful as we like. Now, I am not going to move product here at Google any faster than they're moving today. That's just a reality. They are a huge organization. They have their challenges. So what can I take of that challenge that's inside my control? How can I pivot the problem so it's something I can affect change in? So that's one thing. Identify your challenge. And then from there, you need to think about who's involved in your challenge. Who are the people? What are the processes? What do you need to touch to address the challenge? We often build an influence map around this area because if part of the problem is people, influence maps are very helpful to say, well, I have to influence James. He's at the center of my map. Who are the people that surround James to help me get to James? Who are the people that are on the outer circle? So you build that map and then you methodically go about influencing those people. And then the last piece is look for the learning, look for the failure and build that into everything you do moving forward. I talked about the lightning talks where we celebrated the worst meeting you ever had. Going forward, I'm not going to make that mistake again. And I'm going to make sure it's not just me, it's my whole team, my whole organization.
Shannon, I like the vulnerability of that aspect as well. It really resonates. Last question I have for you is around the culture. How do leaders go about instituting or creating that culture of experimentation?
I think this is important. In a previous role, failure was never okay. Risk-taking just wasn't worth it. The first thing you have to do is create a culture where it is okay to fail. Everybody says that. Fail fast. That's great. But you actually have to do things that celebrate the failure. We talked about how I've done it with lightning talks. My boss, who manages about 450 folks, builds failure celebration into his bi-monthly all hands. It needs to be something that's celebrated top down, as long as you can couch it with some learning. And that will hopefully take the stigma out of failure. It's going to result in me losing my job or result in embarrassment or shame. You celebrate it. Keep in mind that testing, this is the other thing. You say testing and people, I'm not a super technical SE leader, but it makes me nervous. Does that mean I have to write code? It's not that. Testing is not a technical thing. It's a cultural thing that everybody does. And you can test in different ways. We talked about the go-to-market test with the sales engineering teams and assigning resources. I think if you're thinking, wow, I really want to do experimentation, I want this to be part of my DNA, it's a long-term endeavor and it takes time. You're not going to become an experimenting SE leader or pre-sales leader overnight. Just be prepared for a long-term commitment, and it's transformative if you can do that. And then keep in mind also that experiments result typically in small changes that over time add up and become big changes. So don't look for the big seismic shift that was the pandemic and working from home. That's not going to happen very often. So look for the small changes. And then I think I talked to you about just try to be as structured as you can when you are testing. If you have data, that's awesome. And you can do a retrospective analysis. You can do A/B testing. You're not always going to have data, but if it's exploratory, if it's more squishy, like we talked about, just have your framework, because that's going to then give you a mechanism to report back on. And the last thing that I've already talked about is make sure you're evaluating your hiring pipeline for experimentation and risk taking, so that as you bring people on board, you've hired a person that's comfortable with it. As you onboard people, make experimentation part of the onboarding, and then you're going to celebrate the experimentation when people go live.
Shannon, I really appreciate you joining me today. I mean, this episode has been fascinating, and it's so awesome to hear how you as a leader institute experimentation, innovation within your organization. You really have a real framework and measurement, and you can tell that it's part of the DNA in what you do and how you operate. So I really appreciate you sharing today. But more importantly, I do just want to say thanks for all the advice you've given me, because I feel like I wouldn't be where I am today without leaning into you and learning from you over the years. And I know I feel very fortunate and humbled right now to have you on the podcast and see where things are kind of come full circle 8-9 years later.
My pleasure. And I celebrate your success, James. It's one of the best things of someone who, like me, that I get a lot of energy from mentorship and coaching. So seeing how well you've done, seeing the PreSales Collective as big as it is, it makes me feel all warm and fuzzy. So I appreciate you sharing with me.
Thanks, Shannon. I appreciate you joining us, and we'll see you around the community. All right, PreSales Collective, what an episode. Hearing Shannon's perspective on experimentation and creating a culture is unbelievable. It's one of the most well-developed perspective on how you actually create experimentation inside of your organization. We talk right from the get-go about outcomes and creating a framework, a culture, and really awareness in terms of experimentation, celebrating the wins, celebrating the failures, and really bringing it to life within your company and your employees. We talked about how you actually have experimentation with your customers. And it starts by building a level of trust and what she called talk the talk, setting expectations with them. And I love that she talked about her marketing science team and some of the fascinating work that they're doing. But it's very clear that to create a culture where experimentation is weaved into everything that you do, it takes an experiment. It takes starting small and getting a single challenge and creating a proof of concept around that and talking about the successes and talking about the failures of it, so that over time, it becomes part of just what you do. There are so many takeaways from today's episode that I highly recommend that you give this another listen and reach out to me in the PreSales Collective Slack, because I want to continue to do more content on this idea. And so if you think that you're doing something around experimentation and innovation within your organization, please reach out to me. I would love to discuss further. All right, PreSales Collective, I will see you next week.